Our first keynote speaker of the conference is Leslie Johnston. She joined the C&A Foundation as its first executive director in 2013, bringing more than 20 years of management experience from across multiple sectors. She currently oversees a team of more than 50 people working in 9 countries and has a grant budget of more than 50 million euros, working to improve the lives and livelihoods of women and men who work in the apparel industry. Today, Leslie will talk to us about driving behavioural change and improvements in the supply chain through responsible sourcing programs. Please welcome Leslie Johnston.
Thank you. Thanks. Great. Okay. Great. Good morning. I wish my mom was here, actually. That's really nice. So, you may be asking, why on earth is a foundation here speaking to you all, who are clearly the experts in this industry? And this doesn't quite work. There we go. I want to talk to you about how a foundation, which by design can take risk and think long term, can play a role in really trying to get the data in this industry to the people that need to have that data in order to act. So what I'd like to start with is a little story. There we go. So about 2 weeks ago, I was in India and I met this young lady. Her name's Arshi, and she's about 12. And Arshi is exactly, when we talk about trying to improve the lives of people, she's exactly who we're talking about, because until recently, she didn't go to school, because she's the daughter of a home worker who spends his days sewing sequins and beads onto clothing that eventually makes its way to a subcontractor, that makes its way to a factory, that eventually hits the European shelves. And she sewed alongside with him. And it's things like this hidden nature of the supply chain, that make it so imperative that we have more transparency. Because transparency, as we all know, can be that important tool that not only gets data and evidence where it should be, but also drives change. In this particular example, it was Goodweave, which is an American nonprofit founded by a Nobel laureate, which is working to not only discover this child labor, but more importantly, to mobilize the market, the big brands and retailers, to do something about it. And this story has a happy ending because she's back at school. But there's much more out there that we just don't know, this hidden part of the supply chain. And that's why we think transparency is so important, to see what's happening there and to address it. And in about a month's time, we'll have the 6th anniversary of one of the worst disasters in this industry. Hopefully I don't need to remind you all of the catastrophic collapse of the Rana Plaza building that killed about 1,134 people. And this is a disaster that should not happen on our watch. So I think we collectively all have a duty and a responsibility to know where our clothes come from and how they're made. So let me talk a little bit about transparency. Transparency is a little bit the flavor of the month, but that's a good thing. And we're seeing in the fashion industry, there's actually 3 things that have happened recently that excite us. The first one is this. In 2016, a group of 9 organizations, including 3 labor unions, came together to nudge fashion companies to disclose their Tier 1 suppliers. And why is this important? Well, if you look at 1995, there were only 2 companies doing that. So to go from 2 to what is now 170 is a big move. And what's important about this coalition around the Transparency Pledge is the following. And it said this in this report by Human Rights Watch, is that publishing supply chain information, and I quote, builds the trust of workers, consumers, labor advocates, and investors, and sends a strong message that the apparel company does not fear being held accountable when labor rights violations are found in the supply chain. This is really important words because it's about how transparency creates trust and accountability. And what's exciting about the Transparency Pledge to us is it's doing something that's never been done before. It's standardizing transparency. It's getting companies to basically collect the same type of information, whether it's names of factories and their parents, the number of workers, the addresses, and putting it in place for all to see. And to date, about 100 brands and retailers have signed on to this pledge, and overall, about 170 are disclosing their Tier 1 suppliers. So that's huge. The second thing we're seeing, which happened this month, and it's very exciting, is that membership organizations are accelerating their commitment to transparency. And what's exciting about the FLA is that they announced this month that they're going to require their members, as a condition of membership, to disclose their Tier 1 suppliers. This is massive, because what it means is we actually move from a brand-by-brand disclosure approach to one where the industry is working together and quickly. And to me, what's exciting about FLA is they have a huge reach. Their brand members touch about 85, 86 countries, which is about 4.6 million workers. So this is a really important move, and let's hope that others come along with FLA. And the third trend we're seeing in transparency is this index. And how many of you have heard of the Transparency Index of Fashion Revolution? A few? Olivia? Oh, you work for us, sorry. So this is really important because, well, I'm a big fan of indexes, first of all. Because indexes, let's face it, some think indexes can be a way to name and shame, or I like the phrase, rank and spank. But in our experiences, indexes can be powerful ways to name and fame. So to show and to celebrate those that are rising to the top. Because if you do all the work to rise to the top, you should get some recognition. And what's exciting about this index is it launched in 2016, and at that point, it assessed 40 companies, of which only 5 were disclosing. It's 12.5%. The next year, it assessed 150 companies, of which 32% were disclosing. And last year, they assessed 200 companies, of which 37% were disclosing. So we're definitely seeing a trend upward toward disclosure. And overall, that's a really good thing. And what we're also seeing is that Fashion Revolution did last year their first regional index in Brazil. And they found that between the time when they asked the first set of questions to when they had the final survey, the scores actually improved by 122%. Why is that? Well, when you know your answers are going to go onto a list, a public list, that's a bit of a nudge to actually start to disclose and do more and more quickly. So this thing works. So why then are we seeing this flurry of activity among corporates, companies, manufacturers to be more transparent? Well, in my view, such company-led actions are critical because, to be frank, we collectively as consumers are not demanding the data we need to make informed decisions. And this is a study that was done about 6 years ago by Georgetown University. And I love the title because it basically says that sweatshop labor is okay as long as the shoes are cute. And what it concluded was that though consumers say they care about sweatshop labor and prefer products made without it, our investigation finds that self-interested motivation, the availability of cognitive resources, and a flexible moral context limit their ability to turn their feelings into action. So how many of us have a flexible moral context? Probably most of us. In fact, there'll be a poll later if the poll thing's working, but we won't do that now. Because at the end of the day, we're all pretty good at rationalizing when we want something. And we may not always make the right decisions. So if we as consumers have these flexible morals, how then can transparency drive the accountability and behavior change we want to see in this industry? Or indeed in any industry? And in our experience at CNA Foundation, the answer to this lies in getting the right information, high quality data, to the right people at the right time so they can actually do something with it, something positive. And that's what we're working to do. And I want to walk through 4 examples of how we're doing that. And the first one is a way to get data into the hands of those who have the most to lose or to gain, and those are the workers. And this model is really important because we've partnered with Wage Indicator in Indonesia to basically develop a transparency model that's for, of, and by workers. And this is how it works. The workers share with representatives of the unions certain information about compliance. They answer questions such as, does your employer provide written contracts? Does the employer provide a weekly rest day? Are you paid for overtime? Does the employer allow employees to join a union? Are there people working here under the age of 15? So all these types of questions we're all very familiar with. They're answered by the workers. That's put online in the local language for all to see. And what's important is that the data is then presented in a way that's comparable and quantifiable. And that's when the comparisons can start. Because once that's up there, factories can see how they compare against others in terms of key things like wages or freedom of association. And workers can see how their employers compare to other employers. Are they better off? Are they worse off? So having this out there really empowers both factories and workers to make changes. And I think what's remarkable is that this has been running for only 1 year. Already we have data from about 93 factories on the site. And in this short period, the fact of having all this data in the public sphere has already led to some pretty concrete changes. In 15 factories specifically, which represent about 30,000 workers, we've seen the following. We've seen strengthening of collective bargaining agreements. We've seen the formation of unions when none existed before. We've seen tangible improvements in factories, including moving contract workers to full-time employees, including extending health insurance or pension benefits, including agreeing not to force overtime, and including providing a safe space for union activities. This is real stuff that's happening, all because of this being out there. So we're very excited about this, and I urge you all to watch the space, because as more and more factories are added, we really think this model can transform the Indonesian apparel sector. Let me give you another example. While this is worker-led, there's another example, I think many of you may be familiar with it, which is factory-led. Because at the end of the day, how brands and retailers, as you all know, purchase can greatly impact the working conditions for workers. Now, I'm preaching to the choir here. I think you're all familiar with that. But the bottom line is that if a brand puts an order in for more than the capacity of a factory in a short time frame, is the factory going to say no? Probably not. And that's when you're going to see excessive overtime and unauthorized subcontracting. So it's really important to get information about purchasing practices, but that's just not out there. It's not out there in audit data necessarily, and there's no benchmark out there at this point for buyers to compare themselves against others and how they're buying. So Better Buying sought out to change that. It is really a pioneering platform. Marcia is here, so please seek her out, there she is, to learn more about it. But I think what's exciting about it is this can be the TripAdvisor for this industry. So it allows factories to rate their buyers in the interest of raising all boats. And there's different criteria upon which they can be rated. And what I want to point out is there's been, I think, 2 sessions now of the ratings. And in the last report, there are a couple aha moments for me that came out of the report that I think are important to share. And these are things that we normally wouldn't know if we didn't have this data. The first one is that we found that buyers are not necessarily incentivizing their suppliers for complying with their codes of conduct. They expect it, but 60% of suppliers said that there are no incentives provided. Secondly, this found that there was no significant correlation between the length of a buyer and supplier relationship and the scores in Better Buying. Now that's counterintuitive, because you always think that if you have a long-term trust-based relationship with a supplier over a decade, you'd have a better relationship, and that's not necessarily the case. And then finally, this found that only two-thirds of buyers pay bulk invoices on time. And those that pay late are on average 22 days late. This is scary because these findings show that, first of all, there's a lot of room for improvement for buyers and suppliers to deepen their trust and work better together. And already the Better Buying team is working very closely with brands and retailers to address this and help improve the practices. But it also shows that at the end of the day, workers can be the ones who suffer. If you're not getting paid by your buyer in time, how can you pay your workers on time and according to the law? That's really hard to do. So it's important to get this right, and we're excited by the level of transparency that Better Buying shows. Now, these two models, one driven by workers and one driven by factories, are trying to get data that right now is kind of hidden and get it out there so people can do something with it. But at the end of the day, and as we heard this morning, there's a lot of data out there. There's no lack of data. There's data on certification schemes, there's worker voice data, there's reams and reams of audit data sitting in databases around the world. But the challenge we find in the fashion industry is that there's nothing tying this together. And specifically, this data is not telling a story. And that is what's missing, and that's why we're trying to address this in exactly 2 days' time. We will be relaunching the Open Apparel Registry. This is a very exciting thing because ultimately, the open apparel industry is a way to map all of the factories in the world and link them to the entities to which they're affiliated. So those could be brands, those could be multi-stakeholder initiatives, they could be unions, they could be NGOs, it could be anything. Because every stakeholder has a set of factories to which they're affiliated. And when you bring that picture together, that actually takes disparate factory information, puts it together in a platform that's open source, that allows brands and organizations to work together to actually address some of these issues. And that's really exciting. At present, there are about 70,000 factories that are in the system, and that's through the contributions of about 50 organizations, each of which who contributed about 1,200. And most importantly, given where we are right now, I would like to thank Sedex for its role in being part of this. Sedex is part of the MSI working group and in discussions with OR about linking the respective data sets, which could be extremely powerful. And I want to show you a little teaser for what this could look like. You'll see the full thing in 2 days. But if I wanted to search, for example, what factories are out there that share affiliations with certain auditors, certain brands, maybe an MSI, and it will basically pop up all the factories that have that unique set of affiliations, and then you can dive deeper on the factory and get information about where it is, the GPS coordinates, and a unique OR ID. Alternatively, if I wanted to search on a factory, let's say there's a factory that was firing workers who were striking. Well, who's associated with this factory? Well, I can go in there, in theory. There we go. Type in the factory name. And then when that comes up, you can see at the bottom all the different affiliations. So stay tuned. This is launching in 2 days. But I think what's important to say is that this is a powerful tool that's going to help every stakeholder in this industry. It's going to help brands and retailers know who else is working with a factory so they can collaborate. It's going to help the factories themselves deepen their credibility because factories are suddenly going to have up-to-date profiles and affiliations with respected organizations, like Sedex, for example. It's going to help civil society groups be able to identify who's sourcing in a factory when there's an issue and they want to get quick action. And ultimately, it's going to help workers get access to remedy faster. So for us, this is about the people, and I urge you, please go to info.openapparel.org That's info.openapparel.org. And sign up to be alerted once this launches. And if you represent an organization that is affiliated with garment-producing factories, please partner with OR. So we'd love to link your data into that. So these 3 examples, oopsie, thank you. These 3 examples are working to get information that may not be out there to people to be able to make change. But sometimes, and this is my last example, there's information we don't even really know how it's going to be used. And I think this example in Bangladesh, with Mapped in Bangladesh, is unique because it surprised us at how powerful transparency can be for workers. And specifically, we're supporting Brock University to basically map all the factories in Bangladesh. And what's important about this is when mapping it, it includes not only the factory name and address, but also a breakdown of the workers, male and female. And this is not easy to do. There's a lot of lists out there, but they're not fully up to date. And it was actually quite controversial to get this in place because this brings a level of transparency that's not there, and it needs to be kept up to date to do as well. So to get this data took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to go out and actually find out what's happening. But we have that now, and to date, all the factories in Dhaka have been mapped, and by the end of the year, the rest of the country will be mapped. Now, why is this important? Well, what surprised us is in Bangladesh, to create a union, you need at least 30% of the factory base to be registered. And sometimes factory management maybe inflates the number of workers in a factory, making it harder to do that. Well, with something like this, we actually can't do that because this information is out there, it's up to date, and it's available for all to see. And I'll show you. Here's an example of the system. And if you wanted to search, you could search by all these different things, but including by number of employees. And that allows you, as you go through this, in theory, we could take a poll. Okay, whoopsie. Anyway, let's try it one more time. Okay, well, you get the idea. There's lots of things you can search by. And for us, this was actually a big aha moment because it gave power to the workers in a way that we never anticipated. So where does all this take us? So at the end of the day, transparency leads to accountability and ultimately can lead to the change that we want to see. And that's important. And I would like to actually end my remarks with a call out to all of us that are in the room. Because transparency is not going to help, these changes are not going to happen by themselves. And transparency is just a tool to get the change that we want. So, I'd like to end with a humble plea. First of all, I don't know if there's any policymakers in the room, probably not. But you, policymakers, are really important because you can create the carrots and sticks that encourage more brands to embrace transparency. So please continue to do that. And please don't reinvent the wheel and create your own standard for your own country. That makes things complicated. But there's an important role there. To funders, if there are any funders out there like ourselves, you can take risks. You know, funders, I think, have a responsibility to continue to support these new and risky models that can disrupt this business as usual approach. We have to do that, because if we don't do that, who else will? To civil society, you can keep us on our toes and use this data to ensure that all of us are kept to account. And to companies, it's time to jump on the transparency bandwagon, if you haven't already. It's coming whether we want it or not, and those companies who embrace it and who actually are committed to high quality data will win. So there's an opportunity here. And finally, for the workers for whom we do the work that we do, we hope with transparency that you finally have the evidence you need to secure your rights and to have dignified and decent livelihoods. At the end of the day, all this is for you. Thank you very much.